All right, this is lecture 2 of microbiology. I'm going to talk about emerging infectious diseases. Now, uh, this is a more general, the first few slides, 2 or 3 slides are more general, and they just give you some definitions that are helpful, I think. Originally, bacteria were classified as plants. They were believed to be related to plants initially, and for that reason, that gave rise to the term flora or microflora for microorganisms. The term eventually is being replaced by microbiota. That's the modern correct term, but believe me, many people still use microflora. Flora is less common. Microflora is very commonly used. Microbes that are normally present in and on the human body, and there are on everyone, there's a population on their surfaces, exterior surfaces. I remind you that the bodies, you have both external and internal surfaces which separate you from the outside outside of your body. It separates your tissue from the external world. Your external surfaces are all covered pretty much everywhere by stratified squamous epithelium, and the internal surfaces in most areas, not all, most internal surfaces are a simple mucosal epithelium. But that barrier is dividing your tissues from the outside, and is well populated, in some places heavily populated, by microorganisms that are microbial organisms that are normally found there and actually contribute to your well-being. Those kind of organisms are called the normal microbiota or normal microflora. They help to prevent the growth of pathogens. They help to prevent pathogens from getting a foothold and starting to get established and growing in you and on you, because they outcompete the pathogens for food, for physical spaces. They are able to grow better and faster often, usually, than the pathogens, and therefore they outcompete them. A separate fact about the normal microbiota is that they also, to a certain extent, produce some very important required growth factors, including folic acid and vitamin K, which are produced in the gut. Now, infectious disease occurs when an organism can overcome the host resistance. Resistance is the ability of the body to prevent infectious organisms from taking hold or getting a foothold and start to grow and penetrate and enter you and cause disease. The resistance factors, there are many, and they're not all listed here by any means, include the barrier of the skin, the stratified squamous epithelium, the barrier of the mucosal epithelium. Stomach acid is part of forms part of that those factors that allow you to resist infection, and that they destroy bacteria in the food that you take in, and are able to also kill it. It's also able to destroy pathogens that you might ingest. You also produce on your skin and inside your mucosal epithelium, on the inside surfaces, you produce antimicrobial molecules, typically very small proteins that have a direct bactericidal effect. And of course, let's not leave out or forget the immune system, both the non-specific or innate immune system and the specific or adaptive immune system. If an organism can overcome the host resistance, the result is infectious disease. You could put in infectious right there. I left that out. Put infectious in there. Now, on a fairly regular, not too frequent, but frequent enough, unfortunately, at a fairly frequent rate, there are new or newly recognized infectious diseases that emerge. A new disease is something that's never before been present in the human population, and a newly recognized infectious disease is something that was there but hadn't been identified or seen before or reported. Another definition for an emerging infectious disease is infectious disease that's become or is becoming more common. And we're going to go through several of them, and some examples of them that have occurred over the past 30 to 40 years, say. And they routinely come up. They routinely crop up. When we later talk about epidemics or pandemics, then I'll point out to you the sequence of epidemics and pandemics that have occurred over the past 30 to 50 years. Well, that would be a long list, so we'll stick to, say, from the 80s on. 40 years, 80s onward. We'll talk about that later. Okay, the first one I want to mention, and this is really just, I did tell you earlier, I think in the last lecture, that I guess it would have to have been in the last lecture, seeing as though that was the first one. But I did mention to you earlier that we won't talk about disease until much later after we've gone through the fundamentals. I just wanted to sort of pique your interest and point out to you, so by talking about emerging infectious disease in this particular lecture, then we'll go back to the basic fundamental science that is important for you to understand to appreciate infectious microorganisms. But right now, I just wanted to give you some of the basic characteristics of emerging infectious diseases. The first one I'm going to talk about here is a viral disease. It's called West Nile encephalitis, caused by the West Nile virus. I want to take a minute here to focus you on the fact that for each of these infectious diseases, there is a causative agent. It has a particular name, and there is a disease associated with that. The agent or microorganism causes a particular type of disease, and it has a particular name. And you should be clear on which one's the name and which one's the organism name. What's the name of the disease? What's the name of the organism? Don't get the two confused, which many students do. All right? If I ask for disease, don't give me the organism. If I ask for the name of the organism, don't give me the name of the disease. Here we have an organism, a virus, West Nile virus. It causes West Nile encephalitis. This was first observed and diagnosed in the West Nile region in Uganda in the late 30s. It did, however, migrate over to North America and first appear in New York City in 1999. There's a story behind each of these emerging infectious diseases that I'm going to talk about, and the amount of time I have doesn't give justice to each one, but we will get back to many of these different diseases when we go through infectious diseases associated with different anatomical systems in the body. So it first appeared in North America, believed to have arrived with an infected bird, probably trapped in a cargo ship, in the hold of a cargo ship. You know, sometimes you go into a large store and you see a bird trapped inside the store, flying around in the around the ceiling, the beams in the ceiling. Well, the same thing can happen in ships in the hold of a ship. So ships get loaded up with cargo, and sometimes birds fly in, they get closed in, and bingo, you know, if it survives the trip, which is not an impossibility. Probably not that rare. If it survives the trip, it arrives in the final destination port. The cargo hold doors open, and boom, it's out. It's free. And if it's diseased, this is the kind of thing that ensues. The virus itself, the life cycle, natural life cycle, is that it can infect a fairly wide range of wild bird species, and also restricted number of mosquito species. So it passes from bird to bird because of the mosquito insect vector. That's called a vector. A vector is something that carries the disease from one animal to the next, an intermediate vector. So things like mosquitoes, there's lots of examples of infectious disease that have a vector. In this case, it's a mosquito taking a blood meal from a bird that's infected with the virus and biting another bird. Occasionally, what happens is it bites a human, causing West Nile encephalitis. Remember that encephalitis ends in itis, so it's an inflammatory mechanism, and it causes inflammation in the brain. Well, it was started off in New York City and spread fairly rapidly. 2 years later, it was detected in Canada in 2001. Then by 2003, it had been detected from Nova Scotia to Alberta. By 2009, it reached British Columbia and is now an endemic infectious disease spread through the country. The thing is that what happened actually in New York City was that birds were literally falling dead out of the sky. And people noticed this, that there was an increase in dead birds, and veterinarians were studying it, looking at it, trying to find the cause. At the same time, there was a encephalitis disease occurring in a few human cases, and a bright, insightful vet put two and two together and looked at the diseased tissue in both the birds and humans and realized that this was caused by the same infectious organism caused by a virus. Thing is that as the virus spread, the most susceptible birds, we all differ from each other genetically except for identical twins. Other than identical twins, we are all different. We don't all look alike, right? We are all human, but we do differ, and we will differ in terms of susceptibility to different infectious agents. And birds also vary in their individual birds in a particular species will vary in their susceptibility. Now, this infectious agent caused the most severe disease in a subset and killed off the most susceptible birds, and so there are fewer and fewer birds that were highly susceptible to it, and so it's tamped down in terms of its the virus spread in the wild bird populations. Its ability to infect birds has been reduced because the genes that are associated with susceptibility to infection are less prevalent in the population of birds, and therefore it's sort of reached a kind of a bubbling background endemic infectious disease status instead of rapidly spreading through the birds. And of course, the more birds there are that are infected, the more likely it is for a mosquito to bite the bird and then bite a human and pass it on to a human. So the fewer birds that are infected, the less likely it is. And for that reason, it is still around, it does still occur, but it is at a much lower background level now throughout the country. Okay, let's move on. And this is a map from not that long ago, a few years ago, showing, they monitor bird populations and look for positive presence of the virus in birds. And there are areas where you have more positive birds being detected. Sometimes, and originally when they were first trying to see if the virus had moved into Canada, what they did was they took chickens in cages, put them in the forest along the border with the United States, and then would leave them there. They get bitten by mosquitoes, and they come back and they would collect them and then test their blood to see if they had the virus or not. So that's how they first detected whether the virus was moving north or not. Okay, next one we're going to talk about is a organism. It is a strain or variant of type of Escherichia coli, the bacteria E. coli. It is, and there are many, many, many unknown, in fact, how many exactly, but there are a huge number of different variants of E. coli, and they each have a particular characteristic coding. This one is called 015787. The disease it causes is a acute hemorrhagic, it causes a acute hemorrhagic diarrhea. It can also cause a hemolytic uremic syndrome, so you can get a bleeding diarrhea. A patient could get a bleeding diarrhea or a hemolytic uremic syndrome and producing bloody urine and can damage the kidneys. It is a strain of E. coli. 015787 is a strain of E. coli which has acquired the ability to produce the toxin that can cause these kind of symptoms. It was first seen in 1982 and is one of the leading causes of severe diarrhea worldwide. It can also destroy a person's kidney. It can cause renal failure. Many of these diseases, have a common name among the public, and this one is called hamburger disease. You may not have heard of it, but it is called hamburger disease. It's meat. The reason it was called hamburger disease because, it used to be very, very common to, if you ordered a hamburger, to be asked, how do you want that? Rare, medium rare, or well done? And nowadays, pretty much everyone orders well done, and the reason being that you don't want to have any poorly cooked meat that could still have any bacteria in it. You have to realize there is a major difference between meat that is being ground and processed somewhat, raw meat that's being processed by grinding it up, and a solid piece of meat like a roast or a steak or whatever. The main difference is that when you grind it up, you increase the surface area of that gets exposed to the environment around it. And if there's any of this E. coli around, then when it gets ground, it has a higher probability of being contaminated with the E. coli. Okay. Now, this is an important organism. Its incidence of causing disease has increased substantially since 1995. The organism has been around for a long time. The name of the organism, in terms of genus and species, is Streptococcus pyogenes. However, it also goes by the name of Group A Streptococcus. And Group A Streptococcus, if you look at it as GAS, so it's called gas organism. It is a infectious Group A Streptococcus. The organism's name is Streptococcus pyogenes, but when you see gas or gas organism, that's what they're referring to, Streptococcus pyogenes, a rapidly growing bacteria that can cause extensive tissue damage. It doesn't always cause the same kind of tissue damage. It depends where on your body it has infected you. And I would imagine, although I'm not sure exactly, but whether there's different strains of it that can cause these different diseases, but it does cause non-invasive infections, so they don't invade actually into the tissue. They're on the, well, not deeply invasive. They're at the surface of your tissues, or invasive. So gas organisms are the cause of strep throat, impetigo, all of these diseases, cellulitis. These are fairly different diseases that affect the stratified squamous epithelium in the throat, around the mouth. Typically, you find impetigo in little kids around the mouth, and cellulitis can occur really anywhere on the body, I suppose, and is quite serious. In terms of invasive infections, the diseases it causes are extremely dangerous. The disease processes that it causes are extremely dangerous. One is toxic shock syndrome, which can kill rapidly, and the other is necrotizing fasciitis, which can also kill rapidly. The common publicly used name for this disease, necrotizing fasciitis, is called flesh-eating disease. A very appropriate name because it will rapidly cause serious damage to tissues and advance along very, very quickly. In fact, the typical treatment with diagnosis is if the person has an infection in a leg or an arm, to the treatment following diagnosis is immediate amputation in order to save their life, the person's life. Okay, so that's gas. You'll hear more about that in this course. You'll hear more about each of the other ones that I've talked about in the course later. Okay, anthrax. Now, anthrax is a disease. It's been recognized for a very long time. It is caused by the organism Bacillus anthracis. And in fact, in the 1800s, when people were just starting to, develop the germ theory and understand that there are these tiny things called microorganisms, bacteria, that could cause infectious disease and could be transferred. At that time, soon after the germ theory was developed by Pasteur, proven by Pasteur, Koch, a very famous name in bacteriology, microbiology, proved that Bacillus anthracis was the cause of the disease anthrax. Now, anthrax is particularly important in a particularly important disease. By important, I mean causes a lot of loss in terms of resources and animals in farms, in cattle, and veterinarians and agricultural workers are at risk of catching a cutaneous form of anthrax in their skin. But there is also a pulmonary or inhalation type of anthrax. If the spores are inhaled, it is particularly deadly. Cutaneous anthrax is not deadly. It's not that serious an infection. It can be fairly easily treated. But inhalation anthrax is very deadly. So in this case, this bacteria has the ability to form spores, and in 2001, purified Bacillus anthracis spores were sent in letters by the mail to two United States senators' offices and to several news media offices. People in the offices opened the letters, and this white powder came out, and 22 people were infected, of whom 5 died. They never really figured out exactly who had done it, although they blamed one guy who a lot of people felt was unfairly blamed, and he in fact committed suicide. It's a long, sad story. All right. The next one we're going to talk about is Lyme disease. Now, Lyme disease is a disease, bacterial disease caused by, I just realized I didn't put in the word bacteria here. Remember that it's a bacterial organism. It's called Borrelia burgdorferi. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I've never actually, sure about the pronunciation. It's carried by an insect. The insect is a vector that carries it from one host to the next. And the insect is a tick. It's a tick-borne disease, first recognized in the mid-70s, and recognized and identified and understood as a bacterial infection that's caused by this bacterial microorganism. One of the very first, among the very first symptoms, and it's really quite diagnostic, is a bullseye rash. So you get this bullseye, like a target. You know how you have this, central target, like for archery, bow and arrow target. So you have a central red spot, a clear area, and then a red circle around that. So you get this bullseye rash with this kind of, with the bite of the tick and contamination of the site with the organism. It also causes fever, headache, and fatigue, but later it tends to get somewhat better and these signs disappear, and then what develops later are injury to joints, the heart, the central nervous system. It's a serious infection which can be at times, I think, difficult to diagnose. It has spread into Canada and become endemic in parts of Canada. You can see here highlighted in red. The tick carries the disease from deer to humans. So the ticks are insects that are blood sucking. They take a blood meal. You can find them on deer. Typically, they're wild deer. They'll carry the tick. At some stages, I think more in the fall than other times of the year, the tick comes off of the deer and clings onto leaves of trees, shrubs that the deer has just passed beside. So it clings onto that and just waiting for another host animal to come along. Well, if it happens to be a human hiker, then it'll jump onto you. And it's always important to make sure that you're aware of the idea that you could pick up a tick and you could get a tick bite while hiking in the woods. And it's good to check and examine. You have someone else look at the other person all over to make sure that they don't have any ticks on them after going for a hike or going through a forested area. You'll notice these are all in the south, all along the border. These areas here that have endemic presence of tick-borne Lyme disease. These are areas with high deer populations. Okay. I've gone a half an hour here in the first 10 slides, so I think I'll stop here, and this will be Lecture 2, Part 1. And we'll pick up again at this slide with Lecture 2, Part 2.